What's up again, everybody? How's it going, my friends? It's Carpo. It's a beautiful day here, and it just has been for the last week. I have no complaints about the weather. I won't dare say it's too hot. But I'll get right down to it. I had to make this video because I was reading an article this morning that just kind of, put it this way, when I'm learning about ancient history, to me it's an open book. I have an idea of what people may have been like at any time in history, but as you all know, as all of us are aware, if we're honest with ourselves, it's very difficult to picture not just what 1,000 years ago, the time difference from 1,000 years ago, but comparing that to 10,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago. And when you start getting into like 150,000 years ago, hominids and making tools, we start to get kind of a skewed view of when humans really developed technology, when we created language. And so I usually give it the time frame of about 10,000 years ago. 10 to 12,000 years ago is about, some of the, I wouldn't say the oldest evidence we have, but some of the oldest technology that we know of. And one of the most fascinating myths through history has been the flood myth. And I find this ever fascinating. Even though I don't obviously believe, let's say most people know I'm not a Christian, but I still have a copy of the Bible. I find that it's fascinating to read the stories in there and try to apply them metaphorically, but some of them literally to actual stories that have happened. And the flood myth is one that I've always been convinced was real, and it's because it just makes sense. It's common sense. It's not something that you would have to wonder or guess on. Obviously, there have been ancient floods. The question is how often, and what caused them. And usually, you would think it would be a mega tsunami or a tsunami, whereas a tsunami might be, say 30 feet high, if it's caused by an underwater landslide or a volcano. When you have an impact crater, it's a completely different story. And recently I made a video about the impact crater that was found up north, I think in Greenland. This particular crater was discovered underneath the snow and ice. It has under the glacier, so basically you couldn't see it before. But with satellite imagery, and now that it's becoming much more refined, they're able to see minute differences in surface. And they found this giant Greenland crater. They expected that probably could have hit around 10,000 years ago, which would have put it squarely during, some of the catastrophic, because there's a flood myth that goes, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Things like some of these flood myths go back 7,000 years or more. But the interesting thing is that I think that we're confused with many different myths of many different floods. But there's one particular time in history that, and I believe that was about 2708 BC, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's specifically May 10th, 2708. And interestingly, this falls right in line with a lot of the myths that were written around that time. There was recently, this was about 10 years ago, these chevrons were discovered. Now, if you don't know what a chevron is, you might think of the gas company. A chevron is obviously that, that shape. Chevrons are found where major floods or water has flown inland, and it creates these peaks. And so back in 2006, there was a group of people who were, a particular scientist who was claiming that they believed that not just the chevrons on Madagascar, but also ones that were found on the African continent, I believe. Anyway, far enough, and they were all aiming the same direction, showing that it must have come from a central spot. Something happened in the ocean. So they looked in the Indian Ocean and they found an impact crater. And they traced these back to about 4,800 years ago, which would have been right exactly in line with these flood myths. Now, not too long after they came out with this, this discovery, of course somebody came out and disputed it by saying, no, these chevrons don't point the right direction. They must have been caused by wind. So without me just sitting here without my background in it, I might as well just read you what I saved, because I wanted to make sure that I had this. This one's back from 2006, and it says, did an asteroid impact cause a mega tsunami? And it says, this is from Science in the New York Times from 2006. Okay, it says, on close inspection, The chevron deposits contain deep ocean microfossils that fused with a medley of metals typically formed by cosmic impacts. All of them point in the same direction, toward the middle of the Indian Ocean, where a newly discovered crater, 18 miles in diameter, lies 12,500 feet below the surface. The explanation is obvious to some scientists. A large asteroid or comet, the kind that could kill a quarter of the world's population, smashed into the Indian Ocean 4,800 years ago, producing a tsunami at least 600 feet high, about 13 times as big as the one that inundated Indonesia 2 years ago. The wave carried the huge deposit of sediment to land. It says, most astronomers doubt that any large comets or asteroids have crashed into the Earth in the last 10,000 years. But the self-described band of misfits that make up the 2-year-old Holocene Impact Working Group say that astronomers simply have not known how or where to look for evidence of such impacts along the shorelines and in the deep ocean. So it says, instead of a once in 500,000 to 1 million years, as astronomers now calculate, catastrophic impacts could happen every 1,000 years. So that's 100 times difference. Now, of course, it's going to be somewhere in the middle there. So the next one is from 10 years later. This is after it had already been disputed, and this was basically them confirming their point by studying the actual layers of fossils, because people believed they were wind blown. People were claiming, oh, they were made by wind. So it says here, Abbott and her colleagues have found that giant dunes on the island in the nation of Madagascar may have been created by a mega tsunami 300 feet high sometime in the past 8,000 years. They investigated a set of dunes along the southern coast of Madagascar. Previous research assumed that the matter in these gigantic chevron dunes was carried inland by wind. Now Abbott and her colleagues instead suggest that the matter in these dunes was carried by an ancient mega tsunami. The researchers analyzed 22 samples from 2 sets of Madagascar chevron dunes and their vicinity that they gathered in 2006. They focused on minerals like calcium carbonate, which is often found in seashells. So it says, the scientists found that the calcium carbonate levels from the dunes were usually greater than 40%. In contrast, calcium carbonate levels in areas of the dunes, off the dunes, range from 0 to 9%. Wind-blown dunes are typically 100% quartz sand, Abbott said. These dunes have a lot of carbonate. The sands right outside the areas have basically no carbonate. The dunes also contain an abundance of intact microscopic marine fossils. And they were all intact. Now this is just fascinating. This is saying, with all the research we've done over the past, we've really only been able to analyze satellite data, which has allowed us to better get a grip on how many craters are out there. But some people might think that they can aim these satellites down at the bottom of the ocean and just really map it. It's not how it works. The satellites actually see the top of the ocean, and they can detect a minute difference. We're talking a fraction of an inch difference in miles of ocean depth on the surface of the water, and there may be an imprint or an area where it's higher or lower within a fraction of an inch, a millimeter or two. But over a wide area they can tell that there's something down there, because having a crater or a mountain changes the gravity in that specific area. I found that kind of fascinating. So having a technology, we see that there are a lot more impact craters than we ever thought. And, with 2/3 of the Earth, 3/4, whatever it is, being water, it's, obviously we're only going to see not just the ones that have hit land, but only the ones that have hit land recently. Because, as the continents shift and, erosion occurs and glaciers move in and recede, they cover up any evidence of these craters. But we can see the layers in the soil. And this was the interesting thing. They found that, for example, the impact that killed the dinosaurs, this is how I fell into this subject today. The impact that killed the dinosaurs, they believe, might not have been as intense as they once thought. In other words, maybe not the intensity of the explosion, but what they call these they're basically carbon balls that form when in a large impact. And what I was studying to see is if any large known comets in the past, or asteroids through history, have been known to have struck an oil deposit. Because with all the oil on this planet, and I think, we're so concerned about burning fossil fuels, and I think all it would take is one impact in the wrong place, and we could just annihilate and make our pollution just look like absolutely nothing. In other words, the human contribution to global pollution right now is large, but nothing compared to what the earth can dish out. So I have this mentality kind of that we're going to face some sort of a catastrophe within the next, you know, 10, 20, 40, 50 years that's really going to set us back. And I'm talking about as a species, not as a nation or having your economy break down, but rather a major devastating impact or something like that. And I think back to what it must have been like when the sun was blacked out for days, weeks, maybe months, even years, depending, from these impacts, and how these giant clouds would rise up and block out the sun, and a majority of people would die. But we survived. We managed to pull through, right? No matter how many impacts we've had in the millions of years in the past, we've managed to pull through, at least a few of us. And I'm sure it would be the same in the future. One of the differences today, and this is fascinating, is I had a grow light earlier. I was gonna use it in a prop in a video the other day. And I thought this grow light. It's a sodium vapor grow light, and I thought, wow, this is something that we never had in the past. In other words, if you can't grow crops, you're screwed. You're dead. That's all there is to it. You can hunt. You can try to gather, do what you can, get roots, but if the plants are all dying out, it makes it really hard to stay alive. The fact that if some major catastrophe happened that drove us underground, we actually have the facilities and areas to survive this. Of course, most of us don't have the option to go into some bomb shelter, but I don't know. I think it's interesting, a flood myth from that time period is now being shown to be very possible. And I think perhaps this would lend a little bit of understanding to many of the myths that we have during that time. But it also this is the one thing I really wanted to note here. Regardless of how advanced humans have been through in the past, people have always mostly lived near shorelines. You have a much wider variety of foods. You have seafood option. You can go out on boats, go fishing. And fishing was a major thing for a lot of cultures, for most cultures. And I think that in the past, through history, most people, a majority of people, have been on the coastlines. And therefore, one large catastrophe can wipe out an entire history, civilization after civilization. Not only that, but the oceans rose after the last ice age. Before that, they were miles out further, and so now any group that lived on these coastlines has now been inundated by water. So we are seeing these underwater areas where they once had villages, where they once had large cities, and we're just in our infancy learning about our past, And it's funny, there's so much fighting among the scientific community, fighting back against, well, this couldn't be possible, and this couldn't be possible. I think that's necessary. But at some point, we've got to say, we don't really know as much as we think we know. And sometimes falling back on the stories of our past, especially flood myths or plagues, things like that, they give us kind of a glimpse of what people were going through at the time and what we might be going through in the future. If something ever happens to where we're completely screwed and we have no, let's say society comes to a standstill and you manage to survive, it's going to make recycling just seem like a joke, all the effort that we make today. But we still make these efforts to try to improve the world, hoping that it allows us to remain for a little longer. The future of water is a grim one by itself. We're running out of water, fresh water. The water wars of the future, it's just, I can't even imagine. It's already getting pretty bad, but there are a million things that could happen. What we got to do is live our lives, not worry about the possibilities. I'm a prepper at heart, and I have enough food stored and enough know-how and books in case anything ever goes down. But I have kind of mixed feelings. It's almost like I feel like humanity needs a flood, if you know what I mean. And then I think back to how pious that sounds. So many religious leaders have said the same thing. These people were punished because of their sins. And I start to think, it's not about sin. It's not about punishment. It's about, if you're living outside of your means and you're, I don't know, it's kind of like the people that live in floodplains. You have a beautiful view most of the time, but when the floods come, it takes your house down the river, and then you build back in the same spot. It's insanity by definition, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Humans in general have done that. We've built ourselves on a metaphoric floodplain here. We've set ourselves up, we need electricity, we need all these, Anyhow, ramble over. Let me know what you think about this whole flood myth thing, and if you have heard of it, let me know what you think. This was new news to me, that there was an actual, 4,800 years ago that they found this evidence now that seems pretty solid, that there was a major impact, and impacts like that could definitely lead people to believe God's wrath was upon them. Yeah. And even if there wasn't an impact crater, I'd like to say, some of the times if a large meteor, explodes right at the water line, there's not going to be a crater left. There'll just be a story of huge floods. So, yeah, it's interesting stuff. History is fascinating. Talk to y'all later. Have a good day, and